everybody, it's Eric Pappenfoos. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. It's a beautiful fall day, and we're here at the Pennsylvania State Hospital grounds, right here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. This hospital was built and had the first patients arrive in 1851, and we're here because last week we purchased one of the most remarkable collections I've ever purchased. We went to a home in Northern Virginia that had an extraordinary collection of books, mostly on the 18th and 19th century developments in psychiatry and in themes of institutionalization and madness. It's an incredible collection, and I picked out 5 of those books to show you here on the hospital grounds today. Now, this hospital was designed by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Kirkbride. He was a psychiatrist based in Philadelphia, and he believed in that environment could basically cure insanity. He developed a system of branches that emanated out of a main administrative building. This is one of the original outbuildings here. And each of these buildings had lots of natural light, good air circulation, and we're here basically in a natural setting in a farm so that the people who were patients here could use work therapy and occupational therapy as a means of improving their condition. So that's Thomas Kirkbride, and that's the book that we're going to start with here today. Kirkbride wrote his magnum opus here. Let me show you the title page. In 1880, it was an expanded version of his earlier studies, and this talks about the general arrangements for hospitals for the insane, and it shows in diagram after diagram examples of the Kirkbride plan, which basically has these wings or branches emanating out of a central location. Kirkbride believed, again, that insanity was curable if given the right environmental conditions, and he was basically a proponent of the moral treatment of those who live here. One of the interesting things about the collection, Kathy, is that it also included a number of modern scholarly works along the same theme. So for every one of the original primary sources, we have modern scholarly works, including this fascinating book on Kirkbride. And it was in this book that I found out some really interesting things about Harrisburg. So one of Kirkbride's students was a man by the name of John Kerwin, and Kerwin became the first superintendent here at Harrisburg in 1851, and he worked with a reformer named Dorothea Dix to set up the original library for the patients here. And there's a great anecdote in this story about how Kerwin writes to Dix and says, says, "Thank you for your donation of the books. It's exactly what the patients need, but we can't get them rebound here in Harrisburg, because if we do, everyone's going to gossip, and we really need to get them rebound in Philadelphia." In fact, he says, "This may be the cause of a great deal of unnecessary talk among those who in this town, Harrisburg, think they know more about our business than we do ourselves." So that is the story of Kirkbride. Now, Kirkbride was building on a longer 19th century and late 18th century tradition of moral treatment that really had its roots in Quaker theology. And this is important here in Pennsylvania too. The Quakers believed that everyone had an inner light, and even if you couldn't see that inner light, if you had the right conditions, you could let that light shine. And there were a series of people in a family called Tuke that established in England a place called the Retreat. And this was a institution just outside of York that opened in the 1790s that completely revolutionized the way those with mental disabilities were cared for at the time. Isn't that a cool, wonderful frontispiece? Now, Tuke, who's the grandson of the founder of the Retreat, wrote this book. It was an instantaneous bestseller, and it goes on and on about the concept of moral treatment. It's really the first great treatise to do this, because at the time, the Quakers were running up against a widely held popular belief that those that were considered insane or mad had to be restrained and had to basically live in some of the worst conditions imaginable. Now, I know you've seen those 18th century Hogarth prints of Bedlam and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you about the apothecary, druggist at Bedlam, who was a man by the name of John Haslam. And we have his book here as well. He wrote probably the definitive work at the time on madness. And he talked a lot, unfortunately, about how you needed to use physical punishment and restraint in making sure that conditions were safe, both for the public and for those that were patients here. And I'm going to show you a disturbing image, but it was famous at the time. And this is an image called Haslam's Key. And this is what the Quakers rejected. But this is Haslam's Key. And let me read you, the manner in which this compulsory operation is performed. This was for opening a patient's mouth to force feed them. Consists of placing the head of the patient between the knees of the person who is to use the instrument. A second assistant secures the hands, and a third keeps down the legs. And as soon as the mouth is open, the instrument may be introduced. It presses down on the tongue, keeps the jaws sufficiently asunder to admit of the introduction of medicine. That was John Haslam. Now, Haslam is famous in the annals of psychiatry. He documents the first case of schizophrenia in the UK, and there is a long battle that rages between the Tuke family and Haslam. You can read about that in another great scholarly book called Masters of Bedlam. And eventually, I'm happy to say the Tuke family wins, and Haslam is sued and forced into poverty, and he ends up selling his library. Sotheby's, in one of the early sales, sells a catalog of the Library of John Haslam, very important medical works, to pay the bills for losing his battle. Now, Haslam had an American equivalent, and really the founder of American psychiatry was a man by the name of Benjamin Rush. And I think we've heard of Benjamin Rush here in Pennsylvania. This is one of the earliest works by Benjamin Rush. It is entitled, if you zoom in, Medical Inquiries and Observations on the Diseases of the Mind. Now, Benjamin Rush is considered a believer in moral treatment, but he really couldn't get out of his mind that everything could be solved with bloodletting. In fact, if you look at the number 2 things that you need as remedies, number 1, bloodletting, and number 2, would you like to guess number 2?
I do not know.
Purging.
Oh, dear.
And by purging, what he meant, and this is basically getting the fluids of the humors in line to help people regulate their bodies. But by purging, he meant introducing mercury.
Oh, no.
And right, I'll just read you this little bit of a quote here. It is sometimes difficult to prevail upon patients in this state of madness or even to compel them to take mercury. In these cases, I have succeeded by sprinkling a few grams of it daily upon a piece of bread and afterwards spreading over it a thin covering of butter. Oh, no. So as progressive as Benjamin Rush was in many things, his treatment of the insane, as he called them, or the mad, was not very progressive. But the Tukes and the Quakers sort of prevailed, as I said, against Rush and against Haslam, and eventually they became the leaders in the reform movement. I want to show you one more book, Kathy, and this was a book by the name of John Connelly. It's a fantastic book because it is the book which, by 1830, basically takes the moral treatments of inmates national and in England, and becomes the leading sort of scholarly treatise on suggestions for the better protection and care of the insane. And one of the great quotes from Connelly, which he later puts in some of his future books, is, in making regulations for the insane, 2 things should be considered: justice and humanity to individuals. The first consideration forbids the imposition of any type of restraint. One last thing about this book. I love it because he donated it to a local medical library, and look, it has each of the doctors that signed the book out. Dr. Trumbull, Dr. Wrigley, Dr. Walker, and one after another. They could only take it for 7 days to be allowed for reading, but they read the book and they adopted it. And that's basically how we get here to Kirkbride. And that ends our story of this wonderful library, but it doesn't conclude without a funny book. I wanted to pick one with the theme of wellness, and that is psycho-yoga, or the practice of mind control. And this is a funny book, Kathy, because I know you love yoga, but it basically says what you need to do is get yourself in a state of complete relaxation. And if you can get yourself in a state of complete relaxation, you can control your mind through yoga.
Wow.
Our funny book of the day. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next week and every week for more adventures in the world of books.